preceding some of her time, but in the light of the news stories of this past week, it seemed like it might be helpful to just bring everybody together and talk about it for, I think, only really a few minutes. Now, you'll determine that a little bit by how much you really want to talk about this beyond this. But there's a sense in which this conversation can carry on with or without me, and it can carry on perhaps in the group of everybody who's been around for forever, and perhaps carry on differently for the newer folks who've been invited to a different venue for a different conversation. But everybody may be somewhat interested in this, or maybe not. So you'll let me know. The news story, of course, it got reported in different ways, and I don't know what, if anything, any one of you heard about it. The headline I think that got the most attention is when the Washington Post announced that the Episcopal Church had been suspended from the Anglican Communion. Not sure where they got that word suspended, but they went with it, and that got picked up and repeated elsewhere. But let me back up just a wee bit and explain the context of all this. This past week, from January 11th to January 15th, this is obviously written in an English style, so 11 January, primates, some people make fun of that word, but that's the technical word one uses to describe the head of a branch of the church. So primates of the Anglican Communion gathered in Canterbury at the invitation of Justin Welby, that gentleman there in the middle, Justin Welby, the current Archbishop of Canterbury. They do this occasionally, get together this way. There is another gathering of people wearing purple robes that happens occasionally, historically, every 10 years. It's called Lambeth Conference, and that's where all the bishops, not the heads of the provinces, but every bishop of the Anglican Communion is invited. It's a much bigger party. That party has been suspended. I guess I can use that word that way. Justin Welby, soon after becoming Archbishop of Canterbury, announced that the next scheduled Lambeth Conference would not happen. It was scheduled to happen in 2018, so a couple years out still. It was scheduled to happen. He said it wouldn't happen, and he said it wouldn't happen because, in his estimation, there wasn't likely to be anything good to come of it. Because too many bishops couldn't get along with too many other bishops, and it was just going to be ugly, and it wasn't going to do what it needed to do if it was going to do anything. So he said, let's not do it this time around. So the primates got together for this scheduled week, and I think it was envisioned, and I think the theme of what they came together to talk about was how to walk together in faith. That's the reason for gathering. And so they started it off in a retreat mode, and then moved on to discussions and deliberations. So there they are. There's Justin Welby. Behind him, I think it must be, the picture's not entirely clear, but I've looked around to figure out who else it could be. This must be Michael Curry, our presiding bishop. So he is the primate of the Episcopal Church. And then this is the news story that comes out of it. This is one person's reporting on it. We learned today that a majority of... Now this is... Oh, actually, let me back up. I'm sorry. I did need to mention this one small point. Not so small. They were joined, so the 38 Anglican provinces, joined by the Archbishop of the Anglican Church of North America. Now, after 2003, and the permission to, and then the subsequent ordination of Gene Robinson as Bishop of the Diocese of New Hampshire, a number of people disaffected with mainline Episcopal Church said, you've gone too far, and we're leaving. And there were different ways in which they left, but what has come together as at least the primary voice of these people is what's called the Anglican Church of North America, usually just abbreviated ACNA. I think it's interesting that they decided to call the head of that group an archbishop. Because I'll remind you, if you don't know, that when the Episcopal Church was formed after the Revolutionary War, we decided we didn't like such terms as archbishops. It was too hierarchical. We wanted a presiding bishop, a bishop who would preside when the bishops got together, a first among equals by definition, but not the head of us. And they chose to do an archbishop. Partly because they decided there was too much disorder and chaos in the Episcopal Church. They wanted something that they could organize more. So there you have it. That's the backdrop. So they got together. They invited this guy here, who has no official connection with the Anglican Communion by any definition of it. But they invited him to come along. He didn't have votes, but they invited him to come along on this occasion because at least one, if not several, of the African primates would not have attended had he not been there. Because they too hold that the Episcopal Church has gone too far. And so his being there allowed all of them to come together on this event. So, a majority of primates in the Anglican Communion at a meeting in Canterbury voted in favor of sanctions against the Episcopal Church. The primates, an unfortunate word choice, I know, are the leaders of the various churches that make up the Anglican Communion. They meet together for fellowship and mutual support every 2 or 3 years, but in recent years have used their meetings to try to work on issues of unity. They have not historically had authority to tell each other what to do, but they seem to have claimed that authority at this gathering. The sanctions, and so I want to talk specifically about what was done, because what was done isn't as much as saying we're suspended sounds like. The sanctions were imposed as a result of the decision last summer by General Convention to recognize same-sex marriage. A statement from the primates meeting said, "Given the seriousness of these matters, we formally acknowledge this distance between us by requiring that for a period of 3 years, the Episcopal Church, 1, no longer represent us on ecumenical and interfaith bodies." Mind you, we can still represent ourselves. We just can't represent something called the Anglican Communion. 2, should not be appointed or elected to an internal standing committee. It's not clear they have that authority, by the way, because if the archbishops don't make the appointments and somebody else does, okay. And that while participating in the internal bodies of the Anglican Communion, they will, quote, or they will, 3, not take part in decision-making on issues pertaining to doctrine or polity. Again, not clear the primates have that authority. That's a question that will be teased out in the future. The Anglican Communion in the short, let me just back up. So Episcopal News Service, they send out these emails all the time. I got this email Friday, I think, of this week, and it talks about all the reactions to it. Welby, the Archbishop, apologized. I think this is a very interesting thing for him to do first, after everything else that was done. Apologizes for persecutions on the ground of sexuality. It rings a little hollow to some, I will say. Nevertheless, it's significant that at least he did, because they haven't always. Presiding bishop and primate, that's Michael Curry, speaks on the actions, and we're going to get back to what he says in just a moment. Relationships in Christ are the real instruments of unity, leaders say. And Anglican primates meeting issues communicated, that's what we actually just reviewed. So those are out there as top stories. Do you all want to hear what Michael Curry had to say about this?
Yes.
Good, because I happen to have it available for us to see. Uh-oh, I have to hit a button before I do this. Hang on just half a second. Otherwise, you won't hear him. Bill, I hope it works.
Me too.
It was hit and miss this morning, but I think I figured it out.
In England,
Oh, it's buffering. Hang on a second. Let me start it over.
from Canterbury in England, where, as you can probably tell, it is bitterly cold and there is a fairly strong wind blowing here. Before I say a word about our gathering here at the Primates meeting, I just want to say a word of thank you to you for all of your prayers for this meeting, your prayers for me personally, both here and in my earlier sickness. We are well, and God is God, and I thank you. Let me say a word about the meeting. This is not the outcome we had expected, and while we are disappointed, it's important to remember that the Anglican Communion is really not a matter of structure and organization. The Anglican Communion is a network of relationships that have been built on mission partnerships, relationships that are grounded in a common faith, relationships and companion diocese relationships with parish to parish across the world, relationships that are profoundly committed to serving and following the way of Jesus of Nazareth, by helping the poorest of the poor and helping this world to be a place where no child goes to bed hungry ever. That's what the Anglican Communion is, and that communion continues and moves forward. This has been a disappointing time for many, and there will be heartache and pain for many. But it's important to remember that we are still part of the Anglican Communion. We are the Episcopal Church, and we are part of the Jesus movement. And that movement goes on, and our work goes on. And the truth is, it may be part of our vocation to help the communion and to help many others to grow in a direction where we can realize and live the love that God has for all of us. And we can one day be a church and a communion where all of God's children are fully welcomed, where this is truly a house of prayer for all people. And maybe that's part of our vocation to help that to happen. And so we must claim that high calling. Claim the high calling of love and faith. Love even those with whom we disagree. And then continue. And that we will do. And we will do it together. We are part of the Jesus movement. And the cause of God's love in this world can never stop and will never be defeated. God love you. God bless you. And you keep the faith. And we move forward.
Wow.
Gets away with words, doesn't he? So that's most of what I wanted to say. I guess I will add a couple of other comments following on the same topic, and we'll just let them talk without our listening in. Which is to say, of course, if you're interested, there is no shortage of information out there on the internet. The problem is, as with everything else on the internet, it's hard sometimes to know what's reliable and accurate and what's not. So that's that. There were a number, and this, again, there's been a lot. The same Episcopal News Service letter that went out on Friday that talked about these immediate reactions then also included these particular responses from various bishops. Tim Skank is a priest in Massachusetts, and he's the guy, one of the two behind Lent Madness. We'll talk about that later too. He blogs a lot of stuff, and he's kind of snarky a lot of time. That's his form of humor he likes best. He does some good stuff too, so don't let me entirely color him by that. But he posted something yesterday, Barb was telling me, saying, yeah, every bishop in the country's got to get on this bandwagon and say something or something to that effect. Well, they kind of do, and they kind of are. So there's just a lot of stuff out there about what various Episcopal bishops are saying in response to this. It might be worth your time, if you're interested, just to ask Episcopal bishops on suspension or something. Yes, ma'am.
Did you make that blog list yourself, or does that exist somewhere in cyberspace?
This particular one was I literally cut and pasted that out of a letter I got that I get periodically from the Episcopal News Service. ENS is how it abbreviates, but Episcopal News Service will connect you with this and much, much more if you're interested. One person's reaction, this would be this person. I put this on Facebook as soon as I heard about this. The Episcopal Church has just been suspended. I think it's a tad ridiculous. This is me. This is my opinion. I think it's a tad ridiculous. And I think it rather misses the point that the Anglican Communion, if it's worth anything, is about the relationships we share, not the structures we support. I was actually very gratified when I later heard Michael Curry saying something similar. He talks about its relationships. And my immediate response, I think, to Jan when she came in the office says, "Did you hear? Did you hear?" My immediate response to her was, there is no such thing called the Anglican Communion. Which is to say, there is no real structure, organization, such as, say, the Vatican, that oversees all the Roman Catholic churches of the world. There is no such thing on top called the Anglican Communion that organizes all the rest of us. Our forebears, this goes back to Revolutionary War times, our forebears severed the ties that presumed to dictate, that is to us, when we established ourselves as a separate nation and a separate church, the Episcopal Church, the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America. And we dared to assert that the bonds of affection could withstand it all. I still dare to assert the same still holds true in our own day. That's what I posted on Facebook, and I'll tell you a little sidebar here. It was a moment in which I said to myself, you know, it's a good thing you didn't get elected bishop. I just threw that on Facebook, and I didn't really think very hard about it. And I think if I had been elected bishop, I'd be thinking, now what would the bishop of the Diocese of Eastern Oregon be? I might have got slowed down a little bit. Yes, ma'am.
Well, it seems to me that this is coming out of fear that we are going to somehow influence what they do. Like they say we can't be involved in any decision making, but we don't decide for them either. And we never have.
That's what we hold to be true, is these provinces of the Anglican Communion have always been independent and autonomous.
So it really doesn't change anything.
It doesn't change a thing internally. It changes some things in terms of our relationships. It's not clear exactly what changes there because, again, as I said, it's not clear that the primates even have authority over that. The Anglican Consultative Council, I really am seeing your hands. I want to come back.
That's fine.
The Anglican Consultative Council exists as close as we have to a policy-making body of the Anglican Communion.
So it's kind of
But
like
the primates don't appoint them.
it's kind of like not talking to your spouse. Just by not talking to your spouse doesn't negate your marriage.
That's right. Amongst all I could have gone anywhere. Celine sent me a statement from her former bishop in Western Michigan, and Joan actually brought in the same piece of email to me this morning. Jeff Bullock sent me something from the bishop. He knows best in Arizona. As I say, all sorts of bishops are doing this. One of my favorite bishops, I don't know if I quite, Alan, he's one of my best friends from seminary days. He's now the Bishop of Massachusetts, and his Bishop Suffragan, Gail Harris, they together issued a statement for the Diocese of Massachusetts, and and I like this because it was positive. It didn't just simply get snarky. In the face of that distress, they said a lot more, but this is a very quick bullet point. We, your bishops, wish to make the following affirmations. First, we reaffirm our commitment to the full inclusion of all Christian persons, including LGBTQ Christians in the life of the Church. Second, we reaffirm our identity as Anglican Christians. They can't kick us out. We're still Anglican. Third, we reaffirm our gratitude for our own primate, the Most Reverend Michael Curry, which I thought was just a nice, you know what? Fine. Sure. And we'll continue to do this, but we're going to remain positive. We're going to move forward. Now, you had a hand up. Yes.
Are there any financial or canon law ties that
would become problematic
No.
if there.
Could you repeat the question, please?
She asked if there were any canons or financial ties that somehow become more complicated. No.
Okay.
There are no such things that exist.
Actually, we give money for causes in their
That's
area.
right. I mean, in terms of
but-
relationships,
Yeah.
the United States, being relatively affluent in the world, provides much important mission support for these places. And I suppose it's conceivable that some places will say, we don't want your money, but I guess not. And the reality is most of our partner relationships will continue without anything changing.
As one who knows some African bishops, they'd like to maintain the relationship. There are very few that have turned down American money. The majority would like to maintain their friendships in the United States, and that's really clear. The problem that they have is if they're in a Muslim country and they come out in favor of homosexual relationships, they could be shot. So,
Stoned.
whatever, it's just but they really do want to maintain their friendships.
It's called dollar diplomacy.
Well, it's friendships, it's relationships.
There really are a lot of relationships. I know a couple of priests who have gone to Africa to have some real conversations about some of these very difficult issues for a lot of people, especially in places like Africa. But one of my dearest friends from Chicago has done a number of these trips to Africa expressly just to sit down and talk. And one of the things Michael Curry said, by the way, it was almost a throwaway line, but it wasn't. It was very critically important. He says that we might have to come to grips with the fact that our vocation in all of this is to help lead the rest of the world. It's easier, as hard as it's been for us to make the decisions that we finally have made in this church, it's easier for us than it is for, as Celine notes, for a lot of people. Our job might be just to be willing to take some of the insults in order to keep the conversations open and moving forward. It wasn't all that long ago when Barbara Harris, different Harris in Massachusetts, when Barbara Harris was elected a bishop in this church, and the same kinds of controversies were coming up, and there were people disassociating themselves with the Episcopal Church because we had a woman bishop. That's much, much, much less a divisive issue today than it was when that happened. So too with some of these other issues. The world is changing, and the United States maybe they would disagree, but we might willingly assert we may be ahead of where everybody else is. And we need, with grace and compassion and understanding, to commit ourselves to the conversation in order that we could be a witness for this statement here, which Michael Curry offers at the end. As in the words of the Apostle Paul to the Galatians, all who have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There is no longer Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male or female, for all are one in Christ. And Paul's categories are being expanded. That's what we hope. So that's where I am, and I just offer that. It took a little bit more time than I ever imagined, but that's the nature of how I do these things. So, anybody else? Yes, sir.
Just one question. When was Bishop Harris? When did that happen?
Barbara Harris. Does anybody recall the date? It's been at least 30 years, I'm thinking.
In the early
Not
70s.
quite.
No, it wasn't early
Was it-
70s.
it was
No,
early
because
80s.
women weren't being
It was
ordained to
early-
the
it was
priesthood
early
Oh,
About
until
okay.
74.
It was in the early 80s.
I'm guessing, I was thinking actually 88. Does somebody else know?
I was just going to say, when I first came into the Episcopal Church in 1980, we did have women ordained, and there were the same kind of flap going on that, no, this is not, we can't do this, it's never been done, God is going to be mad, and there were people who were going to leave, and all this other stuff. When women came in, and then bishops came in. And then we have the gay issue. And it's an evolutionary thing. I can remember 40 years ago as a high school and college student having no idea what any of this meant. I now have a gay daughter, she has a wife, and I'm okay with that. But that took a long time. That was meeting a lot of people. painful, having family, having to go through a very painful divorce with her father who is also gay. So, there you are. It takes a long time to move there, and you may be there, and as you said, the rest of the world may not have come through that yet. They're still dealing with Muslim countries, they're still dealing with coming out of paganism and all those things, and they're trying to walk with their divine horse.
Ordination was 1989.
I was just going to say 1989.
Okay, we'll see what I hope. So what happened. So I was thinking 88, 89. Okay.
She's still around at
By
85.
when we're in the midst of it, it seems like it goes on forever. It's remarkable, really, how much has changed. We'll see where things go. I'm wildly optimistic about the Episcopal Church. I'm somewhat more indifferent about the Anglican Communion. One of the interesting things to me is years and years ago when I did newcomers classes, and I'm going to have a conversation with folks who identify as new here in a moment. When I did newcomers classes for years and years and years, when I got to the section on the Anglican Communion, I would talk to them about the Anglican Communion, and I would show pictures of the Anglican Communion, the Lambeth conferences, and I show them pictures of all these bishops, mostly with dark skin, because that's where most Anglicans are numerically, and wow! And it was like I had to work hard to get people excited about it. And then in 2003, all of a sudden, oh, we're going to destroy the Anglican Communion. Nobody cared until 2003. And I don't think they cared about the Anglican Communion. I think they cared about something else, and they were using that as something to hit us over the head with. And it's become one of their favorite things, those who are in disagreement with where we are as a province of the Anglican Communion. I could say more if you're interested sometime. But I think Joan wanted to open it up for other conversation, and I was going to sit down with some of our newer folks and have a different conversation in the library over here if you're ready for us to move on. Wow, there must have been some interest in something happening today because there's a lot of you here, so that's great. Thanks.